Hello and welcome. I just wanted to demo and show off a way of editing native code and going through a compile, test, fix cycle using vim and tmux, as well as just basic makefiles, to kind of get things done and be able to look at a little bit of information side by side and to have some sort of useful key bindings to treat that environment a little bit more like an IDE. I'm faster in Vim than I am in other editors, and I really like my terminal, so I don't really want to code in Xcode. This is a Mac, but you could do this on Linux or Windows with a terminal editor. You could use Emacs or any sort of terminal-based editor you want. tmux is a terminal multiplexer, and it allows you, in its most basic form here, to run, multiple shell instances side by side in one window, and it's very configurable. So it allows you to do things like do key bindings or send keystrokes to one window, or run commands programmatically, essentially. It also has lots of fancy features, lets you connect to it remotely and so on. So. But I use it for local development, which is kind of nice. I don't know if it comes native on Mac, but anything I've installed for my shell, I generally have installed either from GitHub, just grabbing the source directly and compiling, or using Homebrew to install it. So tmux, I'm just going to set things up manually. I do have a script for setting these things up, but it's simple enough that you can just set it up manually every time you want to. So I'll just run tmux here. Let me just make sure I don't have a tmux server running. I don't. I'm just going to run tmux. This green thing at the bottom says that I am running tmux. It's essentially just a shell at the moment. So let's make it a little bit more. Use my tmux prefix, Control A. Defaults Control B, but I'm going to use Control A throughout. I'm going to run a command using colon and split window -h. These are panes, they're called in tmux terminology. I can switch between them with Control A Q, and then typing that number that's shown on the screen. You can also just use the arrow keys after Control A, and we'll switch between them. I'm going to go ahead and create another window. New window down there at the bottom. And you can see a second asterisked window here, 0 window, 1 window, the 0th and the first window. I'm in the first window right now. I'll switch back to the 0th, which I had 2 panes in. So right now I have 2 panes in the first window and 1 in the second, which is default. I'm going to ignore that second window for a while. But what I'll do right now is I'll switch over to the second pane, which I generally use for compiling tests or the program itself. Go ahead and run make parser tests, which is in my make file here, parser tests down here at the bottom. And this just runs Clang. I'm not doing anything fancy with the make file. In fact, I'm using it in a really naive way, partially intentionally, partially because I don't want to learn the fancy features of make. And this is working great. But I'll run make here, and this is something I want to do just over and over and over and over and over and over again. And generally what I do is I hit up arrow enter when I'm just doing this normally. And so what I've done is I've actually set up a tmux binding that sends Control C, up arrow, and enter to that pane directly. And I do that with Control A, S. And it actually runs the test and then swaps back to the pane on the left. So if I go ahead and I do something like I want to edit these directly, this is using Bandit, so C++. This is a toy parser and HTTP server I've written to learn C++ 11/14 and also the KQ API on Mac for low-level asynchronous networking. But let's say I edit this sucker and I introduce an error. If I hit Control A S, it's going to compile on the right, give me that error, unused identifier or use of undeclared identifier, line 19. So if I recompile that thing after deleting that, it goes through and succeeds. So that's the basic workflow right there. Compile on the right, code on the left. And generally, it's really nice when there's a ton of errors to have a full shell window, top to bottom, of compiler errors on the right, and I can just go through and use line numbers and say :44 and go to the 44th line where that error might be and just delete it or whatever, just edit it and fix it. And then really quickly rerun the tests. It's a pretty nice way to develop. Pretty standard stuff if you're into web development. Pretty standard stuff probably in native development too, but I just haven't seen too many people doing this stuff in the shell. I'm going to use Xcode or whatever. So this is fairly functional. However, I do have the need to constantly swap between an implementation file. This is parser.cpp where that parser is implemented, and the header file, which is parser.h. Swapping back and forth in this window here is not the end of the world, but I like to look at them side by side occasionally. So what I end up doing is using that second window. So if I go back here to Control A N again, switch to that second window. Oh, 1 second. So one thing about Vim is it by default does not like editing the same file twice unless it's like read-only. So anyway, I just went over here to demonstrate that I'm opening the sucker up over here. You don't have to do that. You can wait till the next step. If I swap back here, I go to the implementation file. So I want to look at these things side by side, but I don't necessarily want to lose my compilation window. So what I've done is I've set up a tmux hotkey that essentially runs a series of commands to take the pane on the right, move it to that other window, and then take the other window and move it into this pane. And for me, that's Control AD. And it actually swaps the two, which is kind of nice. tmux does not do that by default, so essentially I've just set this thing up to do that. And then when I'm done, making a change here, or whatever, I can hit Control D and then Control AS and run the parser test again, let's say. The last thing is, it does run, it sends Control C as well, so if I actually want to make the whole thing and run the HTTP server, if I connect to this sucker, it's actually gonna, this has now got output, and I'm connecting it to it with my web browser, which you can't see on the window. But the process is long running, right? It doesn't just die immediately. So if I'm over here and I want to make a change and then rerun the thing, I hit Control AS again, and it sends the key Control C, and then up arrow, and then enter, and that ends the process and reruns the last command, which now I've got the process up and running again, which is kind of nice. So this whole thing is, basically 2 key bindings and Vim and tmux, which is really nice. And then the make file, which is standard voodoo that already exists in the world and people have talked about endlessly. So this is what I want to show you guys. I will show quickly, so I'm not making shit up here. What the fuck? Here we go. Oh, whoops. So the tmux is down. I just killed it, but I will show you guys my tmux conf, which is not that long. The longer these things are, the more unmaintainable they are, is my piece. So this is like less than 40 lines long. Rebinds Control B to Control A, which is the tmux prefix. Lets me source this file on the fly. So if I hit Control A and R, it resources this configuration when I'm developing this thing. This allows me to use mouse mode and scroll up with my mouse, and this is so I can scroll back and see compiler errors that have scrolled off the screen, which is very common in C++ land. You don't have to use this, but I do. This is the Control AS key, which essentially repeats the last shell command in the right pane, if that happens to be a shell. If it's not a shell, Control C up, enter is a relatively benign instead of keystrokes in something like Vim, unless you're actually, you're in insert mode or something, and I'm generally not. So it's a little weird to just send it regardless of whether it's a shell or not, but yeah, it is what it is. So it does that. It selects the pane on the right, sends the keystrokes, then switches back to your last pane. And the last one is the only complicated one, and I bound this to Control AD. What it does is it checks if the current window we're in is the 0th window, the first window that tmux is listing. And sometimes you can get into a situation where you've deleted the 0th window, and that kind of screws up scripts. So what I've done is, if that 0th window doesn't exist, I take the window that we're in and I move it to 0. And that's generally a benign thing. If 0 doesn't exist, it's okay to move it there. So these first three are really just making sure that things are kosher. You have basically the 2 windows set up, and then the 2 panes set up in the 1 window. So this first one makes sure that you're in the 0th window. The second one checks how many panes are in that 0th window, and if it's less than 2, it will split the window and create the second pane. The third one will check to see if the second window already exists, and if it doesn't, it creates it. Once that's done, this code is what is used to essentially send your current pane on the right to the second set of window, to the second window, and then bring that second window into that pane on the right. So all it does is selects the 0th window, selects the pane on the right, joins that pane to the second window, then your joined pane actually sends you there. So then you select the pane that was there in the first place, the one that you're joining now, and then join that thing back to the first window. So yeah, anyway, this is the only complicated thing, and it's only for swapping the compilation back into that sort of back buffer window, if you will, and bringing another Vim instance forward. You don't really need it. The real crux is this compile business and having the second window there. But it's helpful because looking at 2 header files at once is pretty useful. You can also use Vim splits for this kind of stuff, but I find that I've now memorized the tmux crap well enough that it's like second nature. So that's that. The other thing I do is I have a script that I call V, that is like a Vim replacement, and all it does is essentially just what that script just did there. It takes you type V and then the file name, and it creates that environment in tmux directly. And it's buggy right now, so I don't use it. I haven't debugged it. I've just been using tmux split window to get the thing set up, and you only do it once every once in a while. The other nice thing about this is if you're doing projects, say you have multiple projects. In this case, I've got a few HTTP, another compiler that I was working on, and then some sandbox for some C++ stuff. And then, I also do web development all the time. So if I'm, working on some web development crap, I can actually set up a tmux session, be working on some web development stuff, and then essentially, if you tmux detach, this stuff stays around saved, and you can have multiple sessions going, and then if you do attach session, you can reattach to the thing, and it will, let's say I had this open, just so you can understand what I'm saying a little more clearly. There we go, finally. So if I'm over here in that HTTP situation and I'm editing this bad boy, god damn. And then I want to switch, I can. I can essentially very quickly switch back to where I was in this other environment. So I can context switch between web development and C++ very quickly with tmux. Anyway, I think that's about it. That's really the only stuff that I use. I do use this fuzzy CD utility called Z. It's a guy named Ruppa on GitHub. I'll put that in the description as well all the time. It's really nice for switching between directories that are in really disparate places. So this thing is you know, over here in my web directory, and this thing's over here in my native directory, and I've only had to type a little bit to switch between them. So that's all I got. Thanks, guys.